This is my first ever children's book, and I was really excited about it because actually to be honest, there was a children's story writing competition and I entered and actually got one of the awards, and part of the prize was they published the book. So I never thought I could write for children, and this is really, really exciting. The book itself is about a child who is part black French and part Singapore Chinese, who comes to Singapore for the first time and meets the dark side of the Singapore family and the dark side of Singapore, along with mangrove swamps, oat trees, food that looks terrible from the outside but turns out not so bad. And it's all about how she evolves into getting to know things better, how people who seem to be nice to you, like your aunts, can actually be evil underside, and some people who seem to be strange gardeners actually turn out to be relatives who are good. I was hoping this would appeal to children about 10 to 12 years old. The main character, her name is Lizzie, is actually about 11. She would like you to think she's almost 12, but she's actually just 11. But I found children who are like almost 10 telling me that they liked it. So I think a lot of it depends on how old you are. And I find that children tend to like to read about children who are slightly older than themselves. At least I did when I was young. What is she like is, I suppose, even though she's not at all like me in looks, she's very like I was when I was young, about that age. Because I also had a grandfather with a huge house with an enormous garden that I was a bit afraid of. And I used to be afraid of things like the swamps and the banana trees. When I look back, actually, it was not such a big place. But when I was 9, 10 years old, it was enormous. And I was always afraid of the wild dogs inside there, that I'd get lost. So a lot of what I grew up with went into this book, I think. Even though this is set in contemporary Singapore, a lot of the scenes I wrote about, like the mangrove swamps and like the gardens and like the food, were typical of the age that we grew up in like 20, 30 years ago. Because there are still pockets of that in Singapore. You look at it and you think it's just modern city with skyscrapers, but if you know where to look, like Sungai Buloh, where story is set, you still find the old ways of life and the old rhythms. Small pockets, you have to know where to look, but they are still there, and I think they're very precious. I'd like our children to know about that, not just people in memory who are adults and dying out, but the young children to appreciate that part of Singapore life. I suppose it is also about personal nostalgia because of the era I grew up in. I was born in the 60s, and at that time, Singapore was a very different place. The pace was slower. There were all these lovely pockets of area where you could space in your mind as well as physically. The games you used to play, the places we used to go, the scenery, and all that seems to be dying out so fast. And I suppose I've tried to capture a lot of it in here purely because I miss it, but also because a lot of it is still there if you know where to look, and I want to cling on to that while it's still around because that's very precious. I think it's also about what Singapore is like to a child coming in from the outside, because when she comes to Singapore for the first time, she's about almost 11 years old. And I was a bit younger when I came to Singapore, when I was aware of Singapore for the first time, because I had been traveling with my parents. We were actually in England for some time. They were getting their postgrad degrees. My father got his postgrad degree in pathology, and my mother had me instead. So when I came to Singapore to get to know it for the first time, it was going to school. A lot of things were new, and I suppose without realizing it, I tried to recapture that. Now it's become my country, but at the time, all I knew was it was incredibly hot. Everybody wants you to eat fruit all the time. There were mosquitoes, but it became home, I suppose. And if only I could, I would capture that feeling instead of just being confused at the time. But I'm glad I had the first few years in England, because coming back to Singapore made me more aware of it. Instead of living there all along, I take it for granted. And perhaps that's why I made her, who's half French, come out from the outside and come back to Singapore and see it for the first time with fresh eyes. This is a shameful thing to admit, but I only tried to write a children's book because of the Scholastic Asia Book Award. And I thought, what have I got to lose? It's an interesting topic. I love reading children's books, even though I'm a total adult and I don't have children. So I'll just try and see what happens. And to my amazement, it actually won a prize and they published it. So sad to say, it was a competition that made me write this. And I just tried to write the kind of book that I loved best when I was that age.